Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of the Wildlife Society Webinar Series. My name is Cameron Kovac, Director of Operations at TWS, and this month we're going to explore the importance of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion within both TWS and the broader wildlife profession. Joining us today will be a number of TWS Council members, TWS staff, and working group leaders. To get things started, I'd like to turn your attention to the DEI Vision document that TWS released last month, and that's available through our website at wildlife.org. This document reflects the culmination of almost a year of outreach, reflection, learning, and collaboration by TWS staff and council with TWS members and conservation partners. Leading the push for this effort was immediate past president Gary White, who last year said that TWS must change if we're to cultivate a profession that is truly welcoming to all. So to kickstart the discussion on DEI, I want to welcome immediate past president Gary White to reflect on his time as president and the road that led to the TWS Vision document. Gary?
Thanks, Cameron. My year as president had some successes and had some opportunities for TWS to improve. The Reno conference, huge success, and provided the "all are welcome" slogan, something that I think we all appreciated at the time, something we spent a lot of time discussing. And the other thing that happened at Reno that was an extremely well-attended luncheon to support our LGBTQ+ members. It was a real success. I'll never forget walking around the corner and realizing that room that was packed and overflowing was for the luncheon I was supposed to be coming into. However, before our next council meeting in March, I got a letter from Dan Barton telling me that Humboldt State University could not attend the Louisville Annual Conference. The California legislature passed AB 18871. I don't know what that exactly means, but the legislature passed it in 2017. And they prohibited official travel to states with laws that allowed discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And currently, there's 11 states have laws that disqualify them from hosting official travel from California. And Kentucky was among them. Well, it turns out that 20% of our TWS membership lives in those states that were banned by the travel ban. And then furthermore, in retaliation, Texas and Oklahoma passed issues that bans travel to California. As you can imagine, in our council meeting, we had long and intense discussion about all this, kind of like the bathroom issue at the Raleigh, North Carolina conference. Well, we just had to move on, but the issue went away temporarily. Why? COVID-19 was suddenly front and center. Elbow bumping at the March was the norm at the March council meeting, although no masks were in evidence. Well, obviously, we know all that changed. Nobody wanted to believe that COVID was such a big deal, and we found out very different. Council meetings were now officially on Zoom, including the upcoming September annual meeting at the TWS conference. Staff were scrambling to figure out how to conduct a virtual conference. So COVID-19 was the first train wreck that was encountered in 2020. The murder of George Floyd and the succeeding Black Lives Matter movement was the second upheaval in 2020. In response, council put together a benign statement on the TWS website, and the feedback came in. The one that shook me the most was, this is a quote now, "I think I can speak for all Black professionals when I say it would be nice to attend a TWS conference and not be told, you're the only Black person I know in this field." That to become more engaged and learn more about what we're facing, I was able to meet virtually with some of the Black and Hispanic TWS members to get their views of TWS. My takeaway message was that TWS members were naive concerning obstacles facing the underrepresented groups in TWS. Then in a letter to TWS membership, I used the phrase Black Lives Matter and got a number of very toxic responses from individuals that felt TWS should not be involved in these social issues, which of course is totally counter to the path that council has chosen to take for more than 10 years. As a result of all this feedback, council committed $15,000 to promote diversity and inclusion of underrepresented communities. This has resulted in our wildlife vocalizations that you see on eWildlifer. It resulted in articles in TWP featuring professionals. Tricia and Tracy organized the anti-racism symposium for the 2020 virtual conference. And all this led to the development of the DEI strategic plan that staff has completed, and council has approved, and it's ready for implementation, which brings us up to today's seminar.
Thank you, Gary. Now, step one in addressing any topic is first defining that topic. So how does TWS define diversity, equity, and inclusion? To help answer that question, I'd like to welcome someone who is integral in facilitating the DEI Vision collaboration and a true leader on this front, TWS Professional Development Manager, Jamila Blake. Jamila?
Thanks, Cameron. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamila Blake. I am based in Washington, D.C., the traditional ancestral territory of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway tribes. I'm the Professional Development Manager for the Wildlife Society, and my main areas of focus are diversity, equity, inclusion, our Leadership Institute, the Wildlife Biologist Certification Program, awards, and a number of other professional development offerings that we are working on. And as Cameron mentioned, last month, the Wildlife Society Council approved the Wildlife Society's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Vision document. This document was the culmination of a number of discussions, recommendations, and actionable requests from Wildlife Society members, staff, and council all coming together. Starting last fall, we began interviewing members of staff, council, and several TWS members to really develop a collective vision of what our organization and our profession could look like. The goals that we defined in the document were developed through a very collaborative process and a lot of engagement with different stakeholders. And all of the pieces of this document directly relate to the Society's 5-year strategic plan. TWS members, council, and staff all worked together to develop these ideas that were expressed in the vision document, and there was representation from a number of organization units, including our working groups, communities, and our diversity committee. And our investment in and meaningful integration of DEI into the fabric of TWS really needed to come from a place of shared vision and understanding. And that understanding also means that we needed to define what we're talking about when we're using terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Especially over the past year, these have come to be seen as buzzwords, but that doesn't diminish the importance of being able to communicate your organization's and your personal vision and goals. So early on in the process of developing this vision document, we defined what we meant when we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in the document, we have diversity defined as the broad spectrum of identities reflective of the overall human populations, resulting in a richness of perspectives and contributions. Equity as fairness in providing resources, access, and opportunities with recognition of historic, institutional, and systemic disparities. And then inclusion as intentional cultivation of a culture that actively respects and values individuals, embraces meaningful contribution and resources. We're really looking forward to engagement and sustained and effective action and communication based on this framework that we've developed. And the next steps of this process will be to develop tactics for future efforts and initiatives. And with that, I will turn things back over to Cameron, who's going to talk a little bit more about this next phase and how we're going to use this framework for future implementation.
Thank you, Jamila. And in a moment, I'm going to pass it back to Jamila to lead a panel discussion with TWS leaders at various levels throughout the organization. But before I do that, I wanted to briefly walk through the DEI vision document, starting with how we intend to operationalize our statements into meaningful action and the role that each and every one of you plays in the process. In reviewing the organization's historic records, TWS Council really started focusing in on diversity a little over 20 years ago. That's when a council committee was formed to assess the current conditions for underrepresented groups in both the wildlife profession and TWS, and they reported that underrepresentation cannot be ignored and must be corrected for the survival of the profession. As a result, you see themes of diversity reflected throughout the organization. We have a standing position statement on workforce diversity, have published numerous peer-reviewed papers on the topic in our journals, have undertaken a number of initiatives to expand the reach of the profession, and state that inclusiveness is one of our organizational values. While these efforts have produced some significant results, widespread inequities persist. Our profession does not reflect the richness of human diversity representative of the people who affect and are affected by wildlife. So how do we continue the momentum? How do we create that foundation for progress on the DEI front? For me, that answer starts with demonstrating the importance of DEI in advancing the overall mission and strategic goals of the organization. Throughout the DEI Vision document, you'll see that information from a variety of TWS sources was pulled together and contextualized relative to the core focus areas of our strategic plan. This not only creates a common understanding of why TWS values inclusivity, but by tying DEI directly to our annual operations plans and thus our overall measure of accountability to members, we create expectations for process and results across the entire organization. Now, in reading the vision document, you'll notice that it is, in fact, a vision. It is not a comprehensive review of operational tactics or quantifiable goals. It is the starting point for continued dialogue, as Jamila mentioned. We are learning and growing with each and every one of you, and likewise need your assistance in helping us fulfill this vision. In the document, you'll find a simple survey for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I ask that you please contribute to that discussion and consider volunteering to help advance new initiatives as they're developed and implemented. And with that, I leave you with the words of our current president, President Carol Chambers. I encourage you all to take action. It takes all of us to build the change we want to see in TWS. And here with us today is President Chambers to provide her remarks on the road ahead. Carol?
Thanks, Cameron. In the past 10 years, I feel like I've really learned definitions of three terms: diversity, equity, and inclusion, that on the surface seem like simple words. Diversity for me is no longer just a biological term describing numbers of species and their abundance, but also an important social concept. Equity means everyone receives the resources they need to be successful, which may differ among individuals. And inclusion signifies meaningful engagement of all people in a process or decision. I've also learned about code switching and how draining it can be for someone in the minority to daily alter behavior and language to fit in with the majority. I've watched and rewatched a video showing the change in land tenure over the past 250 years in the United States, where tribal lands used to stretch coast to coast. Reservations today occupy only an area about the size of Idaho. As a society, we've become more aware of inequities that some people experience in their daily lives. As the Wildlife Society, we're taking steps to reduce and eliminate these inequities for our membership and the wildlife profession. TWS working groups, and informal networks of women and minorities in the wildlife profession have sponsored plenary sessions, networking events, symposia, panel discussions, and workshops. More recently, an LGBTQ+ group out in the field has been working to connect TWS members. These actions are helping us build a stronger wildlife society through awareness and acceptance of diverse values. One of the most important takeaways I've learned is that change won't happen unless we take action. The diversity, equity, and inclusion vision that we're discussing today shows that TWS wants that change to occur. Rather than a few actions as a feel-good strategy, TWS staff, council, and members have developed this vision of where we see ourselves in the future and have integrated this vision into the TWS strategic plan. This vision provides the foundation for actions we'll take and for future outreach to chapters, sections, and working groups to help build a more inclusive environment. Our membership is reaching a more equal male-female balance, but we're still lagging in other metrics of diversity. Something else to think about is the new generation of wildlife biologists that will be training in the next decade. This generation, Gen Z, is the most racially and ethnically diverse generation yet, with almost half being people of color. This generation is also entering college at rates higher than previous generations. Gen Z is on track to be the most well-educated generation yet. Engaging them in wildlife management and conservation is essential to our profession. All need to feel welcomed. So where do we go from here? Start taking action. Mentor someone or seek a mentor. Talk to someone with different cultural values to understand their approach to wildlife management. Hire people who look different from you. Learn why it's important to provide your pronouns. These are just a few examples of things you can do. Our future is diversity. Our TWS mission already starts with the phrase to inspire, empower, and enable wildlife professionals. How we do this for all wildlifers is part of what this webinar will explore today.
Thank you, Carol. And you mentioned in the past 10 years, so I have a fun fact. Carol Chambers, along with Winnie Kessler and others, were instrumental in developing Women of Wildlife over 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago. And since then, the number of self-reported women in the Wildlife Society has nearly doubled. So some of that progress that I referenced earlier. So thank you, Carol, for your leadership in TWS, your continued leadership in TWS, and I look forward to the future. But now I'd like to transition back to Jamila and welcome the panel as well, so we can get started on the group discussion portion of this webinar.
Thanks so much, Cameron.
Thank you.
So apologies to our audience. We run into some technical difficulties with putting up closed captioning, but please let us know if you're having any issues getting all of the information from today's discussion. We want everyone to be able to be a part of this conversation and be a part of the enhancements and future tactics that we're going to develop for the Wildlife Society. So please feel free to reach out if there's anything that you need, and we'd be happy to continue this discussion in a different forum as well. But I'm very excited to dive into today's discussion with our panelists. We have some topics prepared, but would love to hear questions from the audience as well. If you have a question for our panel, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on your screen, and we'll integrate those into our discussion as we're able to. So if each of our panelists can go ahead and turn on your video, we're going to get started with some introductions. Each of you will have the opportunity to tell us just a little bit about yourselves. We'll start with Gordon. It would be great if you could just take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself, maybe share some of your current and previous involvement in diversity, equity, inclusion, and let us know why today's conversation is important to you.
Thanks, Jamila. I really appreciate the introduction and the organization to pull this together. So I'm talking to you from upstate New York along the Vermont border, and I was a employee of the New York State Bureau of Wildlife for 35 years. I retired in 2015. I'm still active in the profession in other capacities, including the Wildlife Society. And as an employee of a state agency, we dealt with hiring, of course, and we would be required to comply with the various rules about hiring. And they were challenging at times, and also I would say frustrating, because ironically, our civil service procedures, at least in New York, made it very difficult to recruit for diversity. Sometimes it just happened, but it wasn't planned. It was almost accidental. So the New York State Bureau of Wildlife is and was fairly non-diverse. I think that's changing. But at the time I worked, it was actually quite hard to diversify the workforce for a variety of reasons, largely because of the civil service rules that we had to work under. And that was very frustrating. So that was my first level of engagement. My second level of engagement has been with the Wildlife Society. And honestly, when I considered running for council, ran for council, and became elected as vice president, I was honestly unprepared for this conversation. It was very novel for me, this depth that we're having now. And several of you on this call helped me think this through. And I really appreciate the honesty and openness that you offered me and worked with me on. And I really learned a lot. And now as president-elect, it's my job as leader of the Wildlife Society in a short time to lead the implementation of this vision. And I was pleased to be somewhat involved in the development of this vision by providing comments as a council member. I'm really excited to be actively involved in implementing it. And I'll say now for the first time, but I'm going to say it again as I'm president-elect, my job really, and council's job, is to answer a question in about a year. What did you do? What did you do to implement this vision? Specifically, what did you do? What actions did you take? I don't want to have this just as a high-level strategic document. I want it to be a blueprint for actions. So my interest going forward will be action. So I'll be very interested in hearing ideas today about what those actions should be. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gordon. I really appreciate from yourself and everyone on council that has really shown such investment in making sure that we're able to really integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into everything we're doing as an organization. So your leadership there has definitely been appreciated. And we'll turn things over to Don to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Don Yasuda. I work for the USDA Forest Service as the regional analyst for the Pacific Southwest region here in California. And I'm the current vice president of TWS. But I've served previously as the Western Section representative to the TWS Council during some of those early years with the Women in Wildlife formulation. And it was really exciting to see the evolution of our thinking and practices as we really embraced openly acknowledging some of the challenges that we all face as wildlife professionals and society faces with the issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion. I've also the former chair of the Ethnic and Gender Diversity Working Group. And as Jenn, who will follow me, will talk a little bit about some of the evolution of that working group that you'll see and how we even changed what we call that working group, change of the name. But I really think that it's important that we engage in this because we really are embarking on foundational change. And to accomplish this, I think it's critically important that we foster and encourage open dialogue. And that really what's important is that we learn and practice showing compassion and extending grace to each other as we embark on this. This foundational change isn't easy. It's a real challenge. But the challenge ahead for us is to really value the evolution of our thinking as individuals and our practices as an organization. And beyond that, our thinking and our practices societally about how do we fully embrace the rich diversity that is being human and interacting with each other. And so I think by having and creating safe spaces for us to talk about this and recognize we're each on an individual journey as we're organizationally embarking on a journey is going to be really important. And I hope that that challenge to all of us is really taken to heart. We each have to do our piece, whatever that is and wherever we are at, and continually strive to grow and improve. And if we can do that, I think there are tremendous things that we can be leaders in the wildlife profession and in the conservation community.
Thanks so much, Don, and thank you for being part of creating those safe spaces to have these conversations, whether it's your work on council, chair of the diversity committee, or your work with the working group. You've been really integral in getting a lot of these ideas pushed to the forefront, so we really appreciate your work with that. And Jenn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Jenn Malpass. I am the current chair of the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Awareness Working Group. We were formerly the Ethnic and Gender Diversity Working Group. We've gone through some charter changes and a name change in the past year. I currently work with the U.S. Geological Survey as a biologist on the partner and employee engagement team at Eastern Ecological Science Center, which many of you may have known as the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. Another name change in my recent past. And within USGS, I also serve as a peer support worker. So we're a grassroots organization of employees who are working to advance awareness and education on topics such as anti-harassment, discrimination, and bias. And within the Department of Interior, I work as a diversity change agent. And that's a cohort within the department that looks at advancing diversity and inclusion as mission critical imperatives for the interior. So I'm very pleased to be here today and be able to engage in this conversation. It's been really exciting to see all of the development and and discussion around DEI, particularly in the last year with TWS, but even, you know, over the last 5 or 10 years as I've been involved in the organization. And I'm really excited to hear folks like Gordon and Don talk about the importance of implementing this vision and moving from kind of some of this high level strategy into action, and really echoing Gordon's call. You know, a year from now, we should be on this call talking about what we've done in year 1 with this vision. So I think that there's a lot of exciting opportunities for folks to be involved at different levels and to think about, again, how we come out with actionable progress on DEI for TWS.
Thanks, Jen. You bring up great points about the different ways for people to engage. There's not just one way for us to be involved in diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And I think you're a great example of finding the different areas in your life in which you can contribute. And we really appreciate that example and your leadership there. And last but not least, Carlos, would love for introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess a little background on me. My official name's Carlos, but everybody calls me Lalo. Even my mom won't know who I am if she hears Carlos. So just please call me Lalo. That's what friends and family call me. A little background on myself, educational professional experience. I was born and raised in Mexico. So I spent half my life down south. And then after that, I came to Texas. I got my bachelor's, master's, and PhD here in Texas. Having left Texas, I probably drank the Kool-Aid of the Texas nation and never left. But I've enjoyed it so far. I currently live in a very small town called Alpine, Texas. Far west Texas in the middle of the desert. I work for Sul Ross State University, which is a Hispanic serving institution. Under that university, I work for the Borderlands Research Institute, doing some research for wildlife conservation. Some of my experience for these types of committees, since I've been faculty at the university, I was welcomed in the DEI committee for Sul Ross State University. So we've had some experience there, which really exposed me to a lot of things. For, I guess, one example, for Hispanic serving institution, we have about 70% of our students at the university are Hispanics. I'd be surprised if I've ever had 3 students in one class be Hispanic. Our vast majority of our students are actually either in business, education, something else that's not natural resources management. And that's really kind of what has led me in the path of joining some of these committees and now serving as a co-chair in the newly formed DEI committee for the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society. Within the Wildlife Society, I'm part of the TIER, which is an early development professionals for leadership. Within that group, they give you basically a team homework for a whole year that you have to work on. And for us, it was the issue of relevancy. So how can we be relevant to those that we serve? And basically our group decided that we needed 2 things. One, to be more relevant to those within our society, and to address that, we suggested the society to create this new committee, which they quickly accepted. And then I guess the other half is to have more engagement with outside of the society. Some of them being Hispanic serving institutions, Prairie View University here in Texas, which is mainly serving African-American students. They don't even have a wildlife society club within their university. So trying to engage with them to create those clubs to increase down the road the diversity within the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society. So that's been, I guess, my experience so far. Newly formed, we haven't even had this committee for a year, but so far it's been nothing but positive and feedback, at least for me. I've never had any negative feedback come my way.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. We are excited, especially to have you on this panel. So we already have questions coming in related to student engagement and support. So I think a lot of your perspective is going to be really helpful in answering those questions and really furthering our discussion and involvement in that realm. So first off, we'll go ahead and dive into our discussion. A lot of our conversation today is focused around the diversity, equity, inclusion vision document that was recently approved. And like many organizations last year, the Wildlife Society put out statements, and a lot of organizations have made promises to enhance their efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'd love to hear from each of you just what positive actions you've seen over the past year and what your vision is for the Wildlife Society specifically moving forward in terms of our efforts and initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for this question, we'll start with Dawn, if you'd like to chime in.
Sure. Yeah, you know what I find inspiring is, and I appreciated Carlos mentioning it, that TWS is creating the safe space to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. But we're seeing a lot of action at the local level with organizational units, chapters and sections forming diversity committees, having discussions that are including considerations of diversity, equity, and inclusion in practices and ways that we're trying to provide service to wildlife professionals. I think that's really important. That and I think we'll touch upon it later. One of the biggest struggles, I think that's one of our Q&A questions, one of the biggest struggles to recruiting into natural resource professions are the communities where these jobs are at, often remote communities that may not reflect the rich diversity in those local populations. And so it's more than just recruiting to hire. It's creating a safe, welcoming community where people work and live. And I think, again, those are things that through example, we can show how diversity is important in doing our jobs as wildlife professionals, but is also strengthens and enhances communities when they can embrace and value the diversity of citizens. And so I think there's lots of ways like that we can lead by example, lead by encouragement. And I'm glad to see hopefully our vision will translate into actions we can do at our organizational level, but also see innovations and shared learning from what chapters and sections are doing.
Definitely having that piece of back and forth and collaboration and learning from each other, whether that's at the local, national, international level, and being able to share what we've learned to enhance our efforts and not really work in a silo, I think is going to be really important for making that progress that we all want to see. Gordon, how about you? Is there anything you'd like to add to what Don already had said?
I think there's a lot happening in some of our chapters and sections. And I know that people are trying to find out what can happen at the local level. And I think it's really important for TWS to facilitate exchange of information amongst chapters. I heard some new things just from Carlos a moment ago. And I think other chapters can benefit from that exchange of information. If you think about our conferences, it's chock full of scientific information flying back and forth. It generates ideas and hypotheses and research proposals and connections in the scientific arena. And I think the same type of information synergy can occur in this space too. What are we doing in Texas, in New York, in California, in Wisconsin about DEI? What specific things did you do in your chapter as a chapter event? And I'm really interested in sort of that grassroots connection, because that's where things happen at that grassroots level, as Carlos really kind of suggested.
Definitely, and I think really being able to build off of a great idea that's worked somewhere else and being able to utilize that, especially sharing amongst all of our organization units in the Wildlife Society, is a way that, at least internally, we can build on some of these great ideas. Lalo, would you like to build on that a little bit? I know Don and Gordon were both really kind of highlighting some of the things you said in your introduction.
Yeah, so I guess the main thing that I've seen so far is the willingness to talk about something that is not always that comfortable to deal with. But I think it's a big step forward, just the creation of the committees to begin with. One thing I'd like to start conversations with, something positive, is rather than negativities, is I've never experienced any bad situation within the society. That's just me. I've never experienced it. I've never heard any of my friends within the society and the Texas chapter to ever experience anything bad. I'm not saying bad things have never happened. I just never heard of them if they have happened. So I'd like to start out with those type of conversations and just say that in my experience, there is no barriers, to my knowledge, of people wanting to join the society necessarily. But what I think there are some barriers are at a bigger level than just the Wildlife Society. And trying to address those, it's tough. It's a big national issue. And patience is going to be key for whatever we try to do. Things aren't going to change. Change is hard for people. Change is scary even when it's for a good cause. So I think just acknowledging that we need to be patient a little bit with the change. But I am glad to see that there's some active engagement that we're trying to achieve. And also that, I guess, for going backwards a little bit, is the need to engage at a younger age. If we want to increase the diversity of our society, we need to start convincing kids that are in elementary all the way to high school that they can join, they can go to college and pursue wildlife as a profession to begin with. But that's going to take 5, 10, 20 years to see those kinds of results. So I guess that's where I sit on that, is this is the first good step that we actually have these conversations, despite they may not be that fun to have, but they're very important, and it's the right way to move forward. And other than that is starting to engage with younger people and telling them that the wildlife career is a possibility for everybody.
Definitely. And I appreciate you having that mindset to bring positivity into these conversations that can be really heavy and bring up some sensitive topics, but still focusing on the importance of having the discussion to begin with in order to have any sort of path to move forward. And then also using that to reach out to our younger generations and make sure that we are tackling these broader systemic issues rather than just focusing in on our specific society or a specific demographic. We need to be thinking more holistically in our approach to this. And then I'll ask you, Jen, about your vision for where we can be going from here and anything positive that you've seen over the past year.
Well, I want to tie into something that Carlos said that really stood out to me, was this idea that he hasn't experienced these things himself, or has someone within his own network who has reported experiencing kind of barriers to inclusion themselves. And here he is on this panel, and here he is engaged in these committees. And so this idea of, really getting a lot of different folks involved in the conversation, whether or not they've had a personal experience with that, and just a great testament to that is, there's this fabulous movie called Picture a Scientist. It's about sort of women in STEM, and within that movie that you can now find online, it originally was created by PBS. There's a moment where female faculty members are bringing their concerns to a dean or a provost. And that individual's response was, well, I haven't seen that, so that's not happening at our university. And that mindset, and these female scientists saying, whenever would we take one person's anecdotal evidence? They had gathered all of this information and they had made this case, and reaching out to this individual in a position of power who could address these changes, that person's response was, well, it hasn't happened to me, so I don't think it's an issue. Or, I've not seen that myself, so I don't think that's going on here. And so I really, what Carlos said about, that's not been my experience, but his, continued commitment and passion as talking about DEI and still the need for some of these things was really, wow, that's sort of like my moment for the day. So thanks. I get really excited about that. And also thinking about, how do we engage people at a younger age? How do we recruit kind of through people's mindset? I don't think that there aren't people who are interested in wildlife from a younger age. I mean, one of my favorite things is just keeping a tally of the number of people who've said in a space like TWS, well, I was going to be a veterinarian, but then, you know, then I decided I didn't want to go to that much school, or, you know, I decided that wasn't a good fit for me, or these sorts of things, or I'd rather work with wildlife. So we've got people out there who are passionate about animals, who are passionate about science, and, you know this from a young age. And, you know, getting them exposure to the wildlife profession as a track that allows them to put that passion into practice, I think will be so crucial.
If I could follow up on that.
Sure, go ahead, Gordon.
That really helps to bridge a comment I'd like to make, and it's sort of relevant to Carlos's experience as well. And it's that grassroots energy, again, at this sort of chapter and section level, and the existence of about 21 historical Black colleges and universities that are also land grant institutions, the existence of 32 tribal colleges and universities, and some number of Hispanic serving universities. And I just wonder, what would it look like to encourage, if not incentivize with money, our chapters to do outreach to those institutions that have something like natural resources or environmental science or the like, and tell them about the wildlife profession, just like Jenn mentioned. Oh, I never even knew that that existed. And I wondered what would happen if more people in those institutions where we're trying to reach those people, if they knew of our profession and what we do, whether that would energize them, incentivize them to take a look at this as a career. And then it kind of goes a little further. Okay, nice idea, Gordon, but where's the resources for those institutions to deliver those programs? Well, if you read our equity statement, it says, recognize the historic, institutional, and systemic disparities. Well, let's think about that a little bit. Where does our money go to for our research programs? It goes to the big research institutions across the country, the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit system, the land grants, and so forth, the R1 institutions. Why? Well, I think that's a question that should be asked, because I think some of these colleges that serve underrepresented people could do that research too, if they had the resources, but they don't.
And I think you bring up a good point, Gordon, and having the resources, but also the relevance to have some of these programs that we are hoping to see in a broader perspective. And we had a question submitted that kind of relates to that, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts. Looking at some programs that have been developed, there was a collaboration between university and Texas Parks and Wildlife, and looking at developing wildlife programs focusing on research and management in urban areas that would be relevant to the students at historically Black University, Huston Tillotson University. Could a model like this be something that we could be doing to reach people that are not currently represented within the Wildlife Society, instead of expecting them to change to join the structure we already have, and really meeting people where they are rather than expecting others to change? Do any of you have perspective or thoughts you'd like to add to this particular topic?
I think one place to consider, thinking about what Gordon was mentioning with better engagement with minority serving institutions would be look at this not only as engaging students, but engaging faculty. There's a lot of research money going to R1 institutions that are then able to partner with other organizations, with other scientists, and do collaborative work. And so, looking at the idea of doing more work in urban areas, we have a lot of folks who do urban wildlife ecology, and that actually, selfishly, that was my background, how I got into this. I was working in suburban areas. And so, we could think about the folks who are already moving in those spaces as faculty, as advisors, working to partner with some of these organizations that maybe, for a variety of reasons, it would be challenging to set something up from the ground up, but certainly, getting that opportunity to partner and collaborate might be a way to bring those folks online in a meaningful way and get get us closer to that goal of kind of spreading those research dollars out, as Corda mentioned.
Just to follow up on that Texas example, I heard a bit about that at a conference a few years ago. And I think not only do the students get exposed to the wildlife field through research, by doing that internship or whatever they call it, they actually get qualified for a job with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So it's not only the education, they're gaining qualifications so they actually be hired later on. And that's where I kind of took a swipe at my former civil service agency in New York. Very clunky, very difficult, not nimble at all. Texas, in that example, seems very innovative.
Yeah, I think that it's really important we again maybe think broader and more non-traditional in our approach to what is the wildlife profession. When we think about things like some of these 30 by 30 initiatives to conserve and protect 30% of ecosystems by 2030, that we've largely protected the remote and wild places. Where we need to do better at protecting and conserving are other non-traditional areas, urban areas, city parks, like you said, close to people, working lands, open space, sort of that gradation that's not the traditional sort of true pure wildland areas where we're studying wildlife in sort of its quote unquote natural environment, but really understanding wildlife where they live, people where they live. I think that really broadens, it broadens the science that we bring to things like adaptations to climate change, because we're looking at animals living in these dynamic and altered systems and how do they react. But I think more importantly, it brings people closer to wildlife, people closer to natural resources. And it is the way to bridge that gap. You don't want to go out and study wildlife in remote Alaska or Brazil, Bolivia, somewhere exotic and scary. How about study wildlife in the city park? Because we can learn tremendous amounts about both wildlife and people by doing that. And so I think it is a way for us to start to embrace the human dimension side that I would venture a lot of us aren't terribly strong academically in the human dimension side. So I think bringing that expertise and knowledge into our profession will ultimately be a great thing.
Definitely, and I think you've all brought up some great points about how we can think about or rethink how we engage and bringing in different elements and really making connections rather than just assuming people are going to get there on their own. And thinking about this piece of recruitment, hard to have that piece without then also thinking about the retention of these people that we're bringing in. Are we properly supporting them? Are we providing them with all the resources they need? And are we taking the time to actually understand what those resources are going to be? We have a couple questions that have come in talking about how to be better prepared to support students and get them into jobs and have them find jobs and internships that will actually pay them adequately. And then similarly, our new professionals or current professionals that aren't currently being supported, how can we do a better job there? I don't know if any of you have some thoughts on how we could be doing a better job or what we're not doing now that we could maybe start doing. I'll leave that open to whoever would like to start this piece of the conversation.
For me, this is an area that gets back to what I've got the vision document here, gets back to some of the question of equity. And so part of the DEI vision is the Wildlife Society Council and leadership are knowledgeable of and responsive to the historic and continued forms of bias, prejudice, and discrimination present within the wildlife profession. And that was a really important segment of this document to me as we were developing this, and to see that kind of an imprint in the final version and that wording, I think is really impactful, because I think that we struggle with equity and inclusion and diversity within the wildlife profession and within TWS because of some of our history. And it can be hard to overcome some of those challenges when many people might say, well, that's what I had to go through to get in this profession, or that's what it took to get my foot in the door. And it's hard for us to imagine and envision what that alternative looks like, that somebody doesn't have to take multiple unpaid internships to break into the field, or be providing, you know, their own field equipment for different jobs that they're on, or, you know, not having the opportunity to, you know, be getting that experience in a way that works with the rest of their life. And, you know, whether that's needing to move across the country or work long hours, or, you know, be available and accessible at odd times of day. I think that for many of us, we can kind of look at some, you know, some of the field work that we've done as some of the most challenging and engaging and wonderful times of our lives. But then you look at what it would take for somebody else who doesn't have the same privileges and access and resources to do that. And it really, you know, it really makes it difficult for folks from different walks of life to be involved in the society. And I think that we'll be continuing to have these conversations because the solutions are hard. We, you know, if we could wave a magic wand and have, you know, enough money to pay everybody $20 an hour for your first entry level job, or, you know, to be able to provide all of these different resources. But I think that, you know, we're getting to the point that we're starting to have some of those conversations, and we're relying less on a mindset of, well, that's just what it takes to get into this profession. And we're starting to, I think, look creatively at ways that we can overcome some of those historic and continued barriers to inclusion.
So here I am, white male 64. And a couple of years ago, Carol Chambers asked me to help with a book they were working on called Women in Wildlife, which will be coming out in the near future. And I wrote a chapter with others on the role of men in fostering diversity in the context of working with women. And she called me and asked me to work on this. And it was like, oh, I don't know anything about that. So I went to people who do, women in wildlife, and I interviewed 12, 14 women, and they told me their stories. I was floored by what I was hearing in terms of institutional bias and discrimination, and worse, harassment, and even worse than that. And so I learned a lot through that process of talking to women one-on-one in a very honest, open way. And my views really changed. I mean, I got mad, really mad. And, you know, I think we're at a place right now where people need to understand what's going on and get mad, because it's not acceptable what's going on. And so I think there's actually an awareness process that has to occur. Gary, earlier in his remarks, kind of referenced a little bit of pushback, or maybe a lot of pushback, on the Wildlife Society's DEI work. And I think perhaps people are like I was, thinking about women in wildlife. We just don't know. We didn't know, but we need to know. So I think awareness is actually important. It shouldn't be underestimated. And I think people that have stories should tell those stories. What has happened that's bad and needs to stop. And we're in a position with the Wildlife Society to stop some of these things and speak up for equity, inclusion, diversity. So, you know, white male 64, I think I've changed, and I think people can change.
All right, well, we are getting close to the end of our time, and I would love to be able to continue this conversation with the four of you. But I think as we're getting close to the end of this, I'd love for us to maybe wrap up with a positive note and hear from each of you just a couple of sentences, your best advice or your insight in how someone who's maybe new to the conversation or is very frustrated by maybe some of the lack of progress they've seen in diversity, equity, and inclusion, what advice do you have for them to keep going or how to engage more effectively in these discussions? And we will start with Jen for this question.
Oh man, I was kind of hoping I was maybe going to go at the end for this one, but that's okay. Put me on the spot. Well, so my first thought, which I wasn't sure, but I'll just dive in, was we need your help. So shameless plug for the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Awareness Working Group. We put out calls to our members for example, our working group is putting together tips for accessibility in your conference presentations that's going to be distributed to folks who are presenting at the annual meeting. And I'd love to think that this resource could be available for our different management units to be using at their own meetings as well. That was, a grassroots effort that came up from our members. We kind of took a first stab at it, and we're turning this around to our membership, which is over 200 strong now, to provide feedback and additional ideas. Because certainly, I'm sure there's things that we've missed putting on that sheet that would be really helpful to engage with folks for the conference. So, our working group is looking for people to get involved and, think about whether this is participating in conversations. We're going to be hosting a virtual movie watch night and discussion this fall. Picture a Scientist is one of the films that you can vote on for that. But there's so many ways to get engaged, and certainly, I like to think that we're a group of people who are happy to meet our members where they're at and to help them learn with us kind of through this journey on advancing DEI within the society. So shameless plug for IDEA Working Group. Whether you need support because you do this work and you're frustrated, or whether this is maybe the first time you've been on a call like this and you have questions or you're not sure what's going on, we can help.
That was great, Jen. Yes, a great group to be involved with. Jen is the current chair and a wonderful person to have these conversations with. So I would encourage you to reach out if you are looking for a place to have more of these conversations on a regular basis. And Lalo, would you like to offer your advice?
Yeah, I guess as finishing remarks, I'd like to share one of the best words to describe what it is that what I think we should be doing or try to do through these committees of DEI. The word is belong. We try to make people feel like they belong to something, that we're all under the same flag of the Wildlife Society. I think retention is a big problem. We're trying sometimes to recruit, but until we make those members already that they are already active feel like they truly belong to this society, that's, I think, one of the major steps that we need to do to be relevant, to make everybody feel that they're included, is to make them feel that they belong to this society. So I'll leave it with that, I guess, is one of the biggest things to do is make people feel like they belong to the society.
Belonging is so important and sometimes intangible thing, but something you can really feel when it's there and really feel when it's not. I really appreciate that piece of advice. Gordon, would you like to share your advice?
Well, I would say this: we need your help. Council has committed to a very big thing. The Wildlife Society is committed to a very big thing, and no one person and no one group can do this alone. This is a institutional initiative and effort. And I'll go back to talking about the grassroots energy that our chapters and sections bring to this organization. We need ideas. As we've said at the start, in a year, we want to be pointing to actions taken. Well, those actions come from ideas generated by our members. So I think, speaking for myself, I think for other members of council, we want those ideas to come up from the chapter level, the section level, things that we can do, actions we can take at whatever level and whatever space is appropriate in that area that you work in. So bring us your ideas, help us to develop an action plan.
Definitely not a one-person sized effort. It's going to take investment and contributions from everyone. Thanks, Gordon. And Don, if you'd like to wrap things up with your comments.
Great. Yeah, and I'll follow up on what Gordon just said. That diversity is us. It's all of us. Every individual has a story, has a voice. Diversity is really us hearing all of those. And so what I would say is learn how to share the podium. If you're already an active supporter and active ally to increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion, find ways to share the podium with others and make it comfortable to be uncomfortable, and help each of us find the voice, find the place where we can be comfortable and engage. And that's hopefully in TWS, a wide variety of places. It might be at your local chapter or section meetings or events. It might be just with your peer group, either at work or socially, to be comfortable talking about issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I think beyond that, it's again, helping each of us be successful. And so supporting each other, being that ally to listen, sharing our stories, because if for every one person that's courageous enough to speak up, there are many others that have experienced something similar that aren't comfortable speaking up yet. And so recognizing that we are all in this to improve, and that as Gordon had mentioned, sometimes the awareness is the first step. And being comfortable sharing that is an important avenue for us to address these issues and the ideas. I think, again, looking forward, we're constantly facing novel situations. And so there are no set answers. We just have to discover the answer and it'll be solved. We're going to have to invent our way, evolve our way into solutions, and recognize that things will change over time. So if we can tap into that thing that maybe got most of us or all of us into being biologists, that inquisitive nature of, there's a problem, I wonder how we might solve it. I think if we can tap into that, we can really achieve great things.
I think that is a wonderful note to end on, Don. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and everyone who spoke on today's call. As much as I would love to extend this conversation for hours, I really appreciate you sharing your time, your energy, your insights, and your perspectives, and really looking forward to continuing to learn and grow with each of you. And I'll go ahead and turn things over to Cameron to wrap up.
Thank you to all of our panelists and our attendees. This was a wonderful discussion, a much needed discussion. We have eclipsed our hour, but I will ask that panelists, if you have a few extra minutes, if you could type responses to some of the questions that did not get answered during today's dialogue. This recording, as well as the Q&A, will be posted to wildlife.org/webinars sometime within the next week. And I hope that you are able to join us for next month's webinar, which will be hosted by the Student Development Working Group on August 16th at 2 p.m. They're going to explore TWS operations. All right, thank you so much.